And I'm sorry to say we had some problem with transmission with that last session. So if your viewing was interrupted, I want to reassure you we will be posting the entire session on all of our platforms. We hope that you'll take advantage of that and watch what was a great conversation. And now let me introduce our final guest. Anders Fogh Rasmussen is, of course, the chairman of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. He's with us, as is Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt is the former CEO of Google, and he also was chairman of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which recently released its final report. Over this last day and a half, we have spent a lot of time talking about the interplay between technology and democracy. A lot of our conversation has dwelled on social media. Artificial intelligence is part of that conversation, but it is also a lot more. We're going to dig into that in just a moment, but first, Anders, I wondered if you want to sum up what's been said so far at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit about technology and democracy.
I think there is widespread agreement that technology is essential when it comes to democracy. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's an instrument, and it's very much dependent on how you use technology. You can use technology to promote freedom and democracy, and you can use technology to suppress freedom and democracy. And it's our task to make sure that new technology, be it information and communication technology or artificial intelligence, that new technology is really used to promote freedom and democracy. I think this is the main conclusion from our deliberations in Copenhagen.
Eric Schmidt, as I mentioned, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence has issued its final report, and it was something of a call to arms, saying that the U.S. at least is not prepared to defend or compete when it comes to artificial intelligence. Tell us, first of all, why this is so important.
Well, first, thank you, Jeanne, for hosting this. And I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, who's been somebody I've known for a long time, for participating in this with me. 2 years ago, the Congress asked a group, of which I was elected the head, to try to figure out what was going to happen in the global geopolitical system with AI, and in particular with the focus of national security for the United States. We've produced a very, very thorough analysis of where the technology is and where the countries are. And our headline is that this is going to be the big competition over the next 5 or 10 years, and that the United States is not ready for it. I would say further, I am quite convinced that Europe is not ready for it, and I can tell you why. But this competition is crucial because AI will become part of the fabric of all of the leading industries for the next essentially 10 to 20 years. China has a policy in this area, which they publicized, and they're investing heavily. The West does not have a policy. We propose one for the West.
China has said that it's going to be number one in AI by 2030. Are they going to succeed?
Well, a lot depends on what we do now. We looked at the question of whether the West is ahead of China and how far ahead. And we concluded that the United States is somewhat ahead of China. And we used a set of metrics, including research papers, investment, and so forth. But we conclude that China will catch up very quickly. The great battle in AI, people think of it as data, and data is very important, and China has a lot of it. But the real battle in AI is talent. And what we talk about is the importance of talent in the United States, and in particular pro-immigration, to try to get that talent globally to work on these problems. Put another way about AI, AI will ultimately transform our society in ways which are very hard to describe and very, very big. And we're just at the first steps of that. We still don't, for example, understand exactly how the algorithms work. They can't explain themselves. Put another way, it's an intelligence that cannot tell you why it did something. And there are also all sorts of problems, biases, data problems, and these sorts of things, which researchers are working on. So we call for a number of things, a lot of recruiting of talent, a lot of changes in United States policy, the building of partnerships with Western democracies. This is particularly focused on the leading countries of Europe and the place where the technology is, and a tremendous amount of investment in research and development in these areas.
I want to talk a lot more about that international cooperation, but first I'd like to, if you could, to draw a clearer picture of what's at stake. Your report calls this, I believe, the ultimate dual-use technology. It can obviously be used to great benefit in many ways, but explain to us why democracies could be concerned about how AI could be weaponized against them.
Well, let's start with the prejudice that I had for a long time. As most liberal Democrat type people in the West, people who believe in liberal democracy, which we all do, we have assumed that the Chinese model, which is autocratic, would be subscale, that they would not be able to cross this transition of capability, that they would not be able to essentially build a great country of great researchers and fantastic companies. That was our prejudice. We thought that they would be caught in the middle income trap. Because this round of technology benefits from centralization, think of it as lots of data, lots of powerful computers, there's lots of reasons to think that the technologies that they are doing or that they will be doing will make a huge difference in terms of their leading. Let's use healthcare as something incredibly important. If you took all of the healthcare data of everybody in a country, which you can do in China, but you cannot do in the West, and you certainly cannot do that in Europe, put it all in one big database, you could get insights about disease and, for example, cancer that you wouldn't see unless you looked at all the data. The current generation of AI is really about looking at patterns. It's very good at looking at a pattern and saying, I've seen this pattern before, right? The other thing that's interesting about AI is that the vision systems are better than humans now. So that's why self-driving cars make sense. It's why the doctor should use a computer to examine you, and the computer should give advice to the doctor, and the doctor should say, based on my judgment and the computer's analysis, this is there. This is called the hybrid model. So the long-winded way of answering this, or hopefully briefly say that the stakes are very high for drug discovery, healthcare, transportation, efficient global businesses, misinformation, the way democracies work, etc. And if Chinese technology wins, it could have a lot of spillover. We point out in the report the issues with Huawei. Huawei did a combination of government funding and stealing and very clever invention on their own part to build a 5G network that's much faster than its competitors. This is causing no end of problems in the West, partly because of the subsidies that Huawei gets and so forth. So all of a sudden we have to deal with a Chinese communication system which everyone believes can be used to further the national security interests of China. That's not a good situation. So the long and short of it is that it's crucial that the West lead in this and lead with Western values. Imagine, for example, if the dominant technologies were all Chinese and they were based on surveillance, which the Chinese are unusually good at and very much world leading at it. How would you feel as a European or as an American if all of these systems were spying on you all the time? Well, aside from the fact that it's illegal, you would be very uncomfortable.
Eric Schmidt, you just mentioned international cooperation. Anders Rasmussen, I know that this is also an issue for you, and you have launched a charter for the Alliance of Democracies here, which mentions technology. Tell us, Anders, what you would specifically like this to do.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank you, Eric Schmidt, for leading the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I appreciate very much the report. I can recommend the report to everybody who wants to improve their knowledge of this very important area. So what I suggest is to create an alliance of democracies to counter the advancing autocracies. And an important part of that alliance of democracies is a technological alliance of democracies. And I think such a technological alliance of democracies should have three elements in it. Firstly, a political element where we develop international norms on uses of new technology. It should have a financial element in it to help promote technology that is compatible with our norms and standards in free societies. And thirdly, it should also have a technical assistance element in it. Just the first element of policy, I think, should also encompass exchange of best practices around openness, privacy, security, and data governance. We could also develop export guidelines to promote human rights. And all in all, I think the aim should be to promote freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in joint efforts to counter censorship, malign information, human trafficking, etc.
Anders, let me ask you, what would the backbone of this be? What would it look like? Are we talking about NATO? Are we talking about the G7? Or are you envisioning something else?
Well, I'm envisioning something else, but of course, NATO is a very important part of this. NATO should step up its effort to, for instance, when it comes to artificial intelligence. I think there are severe security aspects of that. We can foresee as one of the next steps in this development the production of killer robots that will actually give us new aspects of warfare that is destabilizing, in my opinion. So I think NATO should really move forward on this. G7 could also be in a trend, but I think we should go beyond G7 and NATO. We should include important democracies across the globe, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India, just to mention some nations.
By the way, Jeanne,
Eric Schmidt, you heard Anders lay out his goals for such an alliance. What would you like to see an alliance accomplish? Do your goals mesh with Anders?
Well, he actually said it better than I do. So we're in complete agreement. In fact, our report names this the Emerging Technology Coalition, and it's exactly as Anders proposed. And we propose that that coalition of countries launch something called the International Digital Democracy Initiative, which is precisely as he described it. And I think that for the audience that's watching this, if you're not in this, you won't understand how central this is to the future of national security. So an example would be, we're going to have a lot of problems with misinformation. How do we deal with that? We're going to have an awful lot of problems with cyber war, cyber problems of one kind or another. How do we have the same problems? And there's every reason to think that 10 or 12 countries, which are the ones that he named, together could really move this forward. Furthermore, the countries that he's describing together are of a similar size to the opponent, if you will, in terms of reach, competency, etc.
I'm wondering if I could just throw a little resistance back at you and say governments move slowly, very slowly, and sometimes cooperation is slow to build. Eric Schmidt, is time of the essence here? Do we have to get
Yes.
moving on this and moving on it now?
Yes, in fact, we're so worried about this that we have organized a emerging technology summit on July 13th in Washington, D.C. We hope by then the various foolish rules that exist that prevent travel from the U.S. from Europe to the U.S. will be removed. We hope that you all can attend in person. Obviously, if you can't, we'll want you to attend by Zoom. So the important thing here is we've got to get going on this. It's not every month matters. And I agree with you about democracies, governments moving very slowly. The Chinese government is not moving slowly. They know exactly what they're doing. They're very intelligent, and they need to be taken very seriously. I'll give you another example, which I didn't mention before, which is the question of hardware. So it turns out that all of the interesting chips that everybody uses, the really powerful ones, are built in South Korea and in Taiwan.
Right.
And China has been trying for 30 years to catch up with its neighbor, Taiwan. We, the US, got largely out of this business over the last 15 years because the Asian countries were so good at it. This is a national security issue, right? And so we have recommendations about that. So we need to take this seriously politically, in software, and in hardware.
Anders, you've been Secretary General of NATO, and I wish you put that hat on for just a moment here. In conversations that I've had with people involved in the technology side of NATO, they said there's sometimes a reluctance to share, that countries don't necessarily want to show others what they're developing. Is this potentially an obstacle when it comes to creating a broader movement to address AI?
Yes, indeed. It is a major obstacle. So I think to develop common global norms and standards among the world's democracies for data sharing, that is essential. Let me just add to what we just discussed. You're quite right. Governments move slowly, and they also do that within NATO. It works too slowly, in my opinion. But I think what we could do is to promote alternatives to technology that autocrats are using for illiberal ends and that can be a threat to our security. We should maximize the impact of government assistance and catalyze private sector investments. I don't think this is a task for governments alone. I would very much like to see private investments as well. So that way, I think we could move faster. And I fully agree with the Schmidt. Time is of the essence here.
Eric Schmidt, talk to me a little bit about the role of private industry and how closely it can or will cooperate with government in this field.
Well, most of the leading work is now being done in private firms. This is unusual because 20 or 30 years ago, the government was the leading thing. This technology is so powerful that businesses are deploying it globally. So you will see much closer relationships between the private sector, tech companies, and so forth, and the U.S. government, partly out of patriotism, partly because there's a lot of money involved. I'd also like to say that I think that Europe is doing things pretty much the wrong way right now. That the first news out of Europe is regulatory. And while there's certainly a space for regulation, the most important thing for Europe to do is to do an analysis of its weaknesses relative to this Chinese threat and American leadership and get its act together, specifically with more funding, more companies, more European investment in these areas, or Europe will then be essentially permanently behind because the two big giants will be competing and Europe will be left behind. And I don't want that.
Anders, you want to respond to that?
Indeed, yes, because I couldn't agree more. And it is a mistake when the Europeans think that they can mediate in a dispute between the United States and China. we should, of course, side with the United States. Otherwise, the free world will lose the race for new technology. So I couldn't agree more. Actually, I suggested when I participated in a meeting in your National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, I suggested that NATO should create a similar, then it's not National Security Intelligence or National Security Commission, but a NATO Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And I think the United States should take the leadership on that.
Eric Schmidt, I'm wondering if one of the important things that has to take place in any alliance, should it be formed, is coordination, a setting of priorities, ensuring that countries are in alignment in terms of what they're developing and that they are, in fact, the technologies that are needed.
I agree with that. So part of this Emerging Technology Council, which the Prime Minister and I have separately and jointly proposed, would do precisely that. I want to remind you that in technology, the governments are not in the lead. The private sector and universities are in the lead. And so if the European response is a government response without a business and academic response, Europe will have no impact whatsoever. And so whether it's a response at Brussels level or whether it's at a country level, each country or Europe itself needs an AI strategy. And that strategy has to include an understanding of where the technology is going, why it's important to the industries of that country, and why it's important to the national security of that country, and who their natural allies are. I believe the natural allies are the United States and the Asian countries to Europe. I agree with the Prime Minister. We need to get these things much closer together. But that kind of communication will be a waste of time without action on the European side. Europe has complained for years that Europe is behind the United States in tech companies and indeed tries to regulate them, which is not, I'm not commenting on. Europe could lead in AI, right? I'll give you an example. A company called DeepMind, which is headquartered in London, is one of the great inventors of a new area of AI. This was done and Britain was part of Europe at the time. When I was at Google, I spent an awful lot of time in Zurich and our AI groups there. The talent is in Europe. The problem is the political will and the structure to lead is not there, and it needs to get addressed quickly, in my view.
Anders, you alluded to earlier to the fact that to some degree, maybe we need to cooperate with China because otherwise we risk having sort of a divided world with two different tech standards. Why is that a critical issue?
Well, if we continue down the road as we have embarked upon now, I think there's a clear risk that we will have a divided world. And let me stress, I'm not anti-Chinese. Actually, as Prime Minister of Denmark, I signed a strategic partnership agreement between Denmark and China. I think we need cooperation with China. However, China has turned into a nationalistic and very aggressive nation during recent years, and we have to respond to that. We cannot take that lightly. And I think the only language that is respected in Beijing is the language of power. And that's why we need an alliance of democracies. Together, the world's democracies represent 60% of the world economy. And we have at our disposal really strong technological knowledge. We should mobilize our economic power and our technological power and use it to the benefit of freedom and democracy.
Eric Schmidt, I had a conversation with another member of your commission last week, Gilman Louie, who said to me, there's no second place in artificial intelligence. Could you expand on that for us?
So, and Gilman, of course, is a fantastic technology and a member of our commission. In technology, there tends to be one winner. And the reason is that there's multiple choices, and then one technology does something better, and then it gets more data, more resources, more partners, and so forth. This is called a network effect. And there's every reason to believe that AI will follow the same path, that the country or countries that are aligned, that invest heavily now, have a better chance of being that first place finisher. That doesn't mean there won't be a second place, but the first place finisher will drive the technology, drive the research, drive the policies, and so forth. It's been true in technology for my whole life, and I have every reason to believe that it will remain to be true for the next 20 or 30 years.
Eric Schmidt, thank you so much for joining us once again, Chairman of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And Anders, I am now going to turn things over to you. We've come to the end of the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, and I would love to hear you sum it up.
Thank you very much, Jeanne. Thank you for your moderation of moderating our discussion. And as we conclude the final day of the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, I would like to thank you all for joining us virtually. And I would also like to thank those who came to the Royal Playhouse yesterday. We hope that next year we can host you all physically as we continue to defend democracy together. And I would now like to thank those who helped make this come to life. Thank you to our moderators, Dean Meserve and Ryan Heath, and team of staff and volunteers who joined us. I would also like to thank our wonderful partners who help support us in not just the summit, but throughout the year to make this conference a success. Thank you. Thank you all again, and we look forward to engaging with you at the next Copenhagen Democracy Summit.